So that's what I would say is it's not the great resignation, it's the great aspiration. And it can start as simply as drawing an S on a piece of paper and having a conversation about where do you think you are in your growth?
Hello and welcome to the Psychology Podcast. Today we welcome Whitney Johnson to the show. Whitney is the CEO and co-founder of the tech-enabled talent development company Disruption Advisors. Whitney is a globally recognized thought leader, keynote speaker, executive coach, and consultant. She is a frequent lecturer at Harvard Business Publishing's Corporate Learning Division. She is also the best-selling author of Disrupt Yourself and Build an A-Team. Her latest book is called Smart Growth: How to Grow Your People to Grow Your Company. In this episode, I talked to Whitney Johnson about business growth. According to Whitney, the development of the individual comes first before the company's. Growth can be better understood using the S-curve of learning, which has 3 phases: the launch point, the sweet spot, and mastery. By comprehending the cycle of growth, we can find ways to move forward when we feel stuck in both our professional and personal lives. We also touch on the topics of flow, creativity, transcendence, success, and leadership. I really like Whitney's approach to business, and I find it to be a real human approach. We have lots of common interests and common ways and frameworks of seeing the world, and I think you'll really enjoy this episode. So without further ado, I bring you Whitney Johnson. Whitney Johnson, it is so great to have you on the Psychology Podcast today.
Scott, I'm so happy to be here.
I would like you to tell our audience a little bit about yourself before we dive into your great work, and maybe tell us a little bit about the work you're doing with Disruption Advisors.
That's always such an open-ended question, isn't it?
It
Tell
is.
us a little bit about yourself.
Go anywhere you want in that.
Well, in brief, I'm originally from California. I won't tell you my entire life story, but some quick facts. Grew up in San Jose, what is now Silicon Valley for people who are familiar with that, and studied music in high school and in college. But when I graduated from college and moved to New York with my husband so he could get his PhD at Columbia, I completely disrupted myself and decided that I was not going to pursue music, but instead I wanted to put food on the table. And so I got a job working as a secretary to a retail stockbroker on Wall Street. First address was 1345 Avenue of the Americas, because you always remember the address of your very first job. And did that, and secretary listening to these stockbrokers saying things like, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know this is a great investment, and throw down your pom-poms and get in the game, trying to persuade them to open up brokerage accounts. And for me, hearing that over and over again, initially I was a little bit offended because I was a cheerleader in high school, but then decided I needed to throw down my pom-poms. So I started taking business courses at night, accounting, finance, economics, and then had a boss who gave me a shot and moved me from being a secretary to an investment banker. And that I would not have known to call it this then, but that was really the beginning of me disrupting myself, of having this sense of there were greater possibilities for me. And so for about 15 years, I worked on, actually closer to 20 years, I worked on Wall Street. I was in investment banking, and then I was an equity research analyst, picking stocks in the emerging markets, and discovered around 2000, 2001, and this is where our worlds intersect just a little bit, is we were doing this big training of our various stock analyst colleagues, and I spent an inordinate amount of time training my colleagues, thinking about, if you were on American Idol, what kind of contestant would you be? Are you the comeback kid? Who are you? What's your brand? And I discovered at that point that I was actually more interested in the momentum of people than I was of stocks. And eventually I did co-found the Disruptive Innovation Fund with Clayton Christensen, but more and more found myself thinking about the theory of disruption, thinking about the S-curve, and how do you apply it not to products and companies, but how do you apply them to people? And so the work that I do today, these many years later, is we have a company called Disruption Advisors. We advise people, companies, how to grow their people to grow their company, and do coaching and workshops around that. So that is a Reader's Digest version of how I came to be where I am today. Lots and lots of personal disruption taking place.
I love it. And Clayton Christensen, rest in peace, right? Didn't he pass away in
Yes.
2020? Yeah, a real legend.
Yes.
Real
Yes,
legend
absolutely.
about disruption and creativity, and really inspired me a lot in my own work and creativity.
Wait. I want to hear this. How did he inspire you, Scott?
Oh, well, I
I'm
wrote this.
curious.
Well, I mean, I wrote a book called Wired to Create, Unraveling
Hmm.
the Mysteries of the Creative Mind, and I think that the disruption mindset is part and parcel of
Mm.
the creative mind. So in the Roll Mays words, the courage to create is, and that was the title of Roll May's book. The courage to create is huge, but it can be very, very difficult if you're a people pleaser, and it can be very, very difficult if you are the kind of person that can't handle criticism. So most people just forget about it.
It's interesting because I read your book, Wired to Create, but I hadn't realized that Clayton had been an influence on you in thinking about this notion of disruption and that it does take, in fact, courage to step back from who you are and the perception that people have of you in order to slingshot into that creative place. So,
Yeah.
so it's nice to hear that tie-in.
Yeah, good. Well, yeah, big time. And I'm bummed I never had the opportunity to talk to him, but actually, he was a big influence on the creation of the Creativity Post, which I founded with my colleagues in 2011. The whole website, the Creativity Post, we were all big fans of his work.
Aw,
There you have it.
it's fun to hear.
Fun to hear. Yeah. I was wondering to what extent you have studied psychology and have
Mm.
incorporated ideas from psychological research into the work you do.
Such a great question. I would say I'm an accidental psychologist, if you will. So I have, for probably since, well, not even probably, since my early 20s, I have worked with a therapist. And so that certainly is a real time application of psychology. I remember coming across Robert Johnson's work, We and She, and how influential his work was on me 15, 20 years ago.
No
Really,
relation.
no relation, but
Mm.
just that was really influential for me in thinking about the psychological development not only of men, but also of women. I remember reading In a Different Voice of Carol Gilligan's when I was in college and how influential that was as well. So the combination of my own personal experiencing self of psychology, but then reading those very seminal, important books by Robert Johnson have very much influenced the work that I do. And then in thinking about personal disruption and thinking about the S curve of learning, my most recent book, you can bet that I consulted with a number of psychologists to make sure that what I was including and what I was saying was backed by actual research and not just some idea that I had had.
Love that. Well, what is the S curve of learning? You talk a lot about it, so
Yeah,
we might as
I
well
do.
double click on that. You love the S
Yes,
curve of learning.
yes, Scott, I do. And your name has an S, so I love the name Scott.
Yes,
Um,
and I am
yeah,
a little
so
curvy.
there you go. Yeah, so I discovered the S curve when I was investing with Clayton. So I had co-founded a fund with him and his son Matt to invest in disruptive innovation. And we were using the S curve to figure out how quickly an innovation would be adopted and to give us some signals or indicators. Is this a good time to be buying the stock? Should we be shorting the stock, et cetera? And for those who aren't familiar, probably most people who listen to your podcast are, but just a quick refresher. Popularized by Everett Rogers back in the 60s. It was around even before that. And what he did is he used the S curve to look at how groups change over time. His seminal study was looking at corn farmers in Iowa and the work that he discovered that there was this hybrid corn. It had a 20% higher yield. It was drought resistant. It was easier to harvest. And yet, over the first 5 years after its introduction, only 10% of the farmer population adopted this new type of corn that would have been made a lot of sense. But once that first 10% adopted it, then over the next 3 years, that penetration or adoption went from 10% to 40%. And so he posited that new ideas are adopted in the shape of an S. You've got a slow start, and then it reaches this tipping point, which Malcolm Gladwell popularized, and you move into hypergrowth, and eventually you get to saturation. So we're using this S curve, looking at how groups change over time, thinking about this for innovations. And I had this big aha. As I mentioned earlier, back in the early 2000s, I'm thinking, oh, I'm more interested in the momentum of people than I am of stocks. I'm thinking about disruption. It's not just about products and services, but also about people. So it wasn't too much of a leap for me to say, how does this S curve apply to people. And so the big aha for me is that it could help us understand not only how groups change over time, but how do individuals change? It could help us think about what does the emotional arc of growth look like? What is the experience that we're having when we start something new, whether it's a new hobby, it's a new job, whether it's our life generally. And so the basic idea is this: when you start something new, you're at the launch point of the curve and the growth is happening, but it is going to feel slow. But then if you put in the effort, you eventually reach this tipping point, you move into the sweet spot of that S curve where things are fast. And then at some point, you're going to reach a plateau, which is this place of mastery, where because you're no longer learning, you're no longer enjoying the feel-good effects of learning, it's time for you to jump to a new S curve. And it answers those questions of why is it hard to start something new? Why do you gain momentum? And therefore it's easy to continue. And why can you be really good at something and feel like you can no longer keep doing it? The S curve helps answer those several questions.
Wow, what a powerful idea with so many applications. You talk about the idea of managing your team as a portfolio of S curves. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit more? How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So um, once you understand that you can use this S curve to demystify personal growth, you can think about where are you in your current role at work on the S curve. Are you at the launch point? Are you in the sweet spot? Are you in mastery? And once you know where you are on that curve, then you're going to be able to know how to help people build momentum. At the launch point, you're going to need support, and the sweet spot, you need focus because you're going fast and you don't want to derail. And in mastery, you're going to need a challenge. Well, once you know those things, then you recognize, everybody on my team is actually on an S curve. And if I understand that, then I know this helps me decode talent development. It helps facilitate recruiting. It helps me deal with succession planning. But if I want to zoom out even further, if I understand where people are in their growth and where they perceive themselves to be in their growth, because that's important. I might think that you are in the sweet spot, but if you have the experience of being mastery, that's going to predict your behavior, not where I think you are. Also, we know that depending on where you are, for example, when you're at the launch point, you ask lots of questions like, why do we do it like this? Because you're brand new, you're seeing everything with fresh eyes. And that why do we do it like this can lead and open the door to innovation. And I know you know David Epstein's work very well of range. He has there's a lot of research in there basically about people moving to a new S curve, that launch point, and they have all sorts of epiphanies about here's where the innovation is. So you do need people on the launch point of that S curve. Then in the sweet spot, people are capable of still asking questions like, why do we do it like this? But they're increasingly competent. So this goes to self-determination theory. They're competent, they're autonomous, they feel related to the mission, to each other. And so this is that place where they're capable of innovating, capable of asking questions around innovating, but they're also at this point more capable of executing against those innovative ideas. And then in mastery, what happens is they're not asking, why do we do it like this? They're saying, this is how we do it, which is valuable because it's the institutional memory. It gives you something to bump up against. You have people who can help bring other people along, do these S-curve loops. And so when you're willing to put together a portfolio, and a starting point is a standard bell curve distribution with 60% of your people in the sweet spot, 20% at the launch point, 20% in mastery. You have people in different stages of your growth, but also different stages of thinking about innovation. And so if you can put together that portfolio of S-curves, it not only allows you to manage people more effectively, but you're now optimizing for growth and innovation in your team and in your organization.
Yeah, I love that. A question: as someone who wrote a book called Transcend and loves transcendence, is there a stage after mastery? Like, have you thought beyond mastery into a transcendent purpose stage?
Yeah, Scott, I loved your book, Transcendence.
You read it?
Yes, I read it. I had you on my
That's true.
podcast.
That's
Everybody,
true.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
I
true.
actually do read the books when I have people. I know, I think most people do, but
I'm
I
honored.
do
I'm
actually
honored.
read
I
them.
forgot that I was on your podcast. Yeah.
Yes. And so it's a great question. And I had not contemplated, I found your work very useful and helpful for me in that sense. What I
Mm,
would say is for me, I think about S curves as almost this escalator. So
mm,
when it's very much a fractal, so you can be on an S curve in a role. You can have your day can be an S curve. Your life is an S curve. And so I consider this notion of transcendence, or if I were trying to put our two ideas together, I would say is that when you get to the top of an S curve, you make the decision, I'm at a summit, but I'm not at the summit of my life, if you will. I would also argue is that when you are in mastery, if you're at the top of that S curve, yes, you need to continue to grow, and yes, you need to find new S curves. But if you're really developing as a human being, you're also going to be in that place at the top of the mountain where you're willing to think bigger. You've got this perspective and you're willing to bring other people along. So you get very much of it both and where you need to continue to grow and to be at the launch point, to be at the base of the mountain.
mm.
But if you're evolving as a human being, you're also in this place where you're transcending and helping
Nice.
other people grow. So that's how I would put those two ideas together.
Yeah, you obviously fold in purpose into mastery. Obviously, you're not just talking about selfish mastery of something devoid of the context of the larger world. Yeah, but I was just wondering how you've thought about the S curve of transcendent experiences. Like, what's the S curve of the flow state? Like, is that too nerdy of a question?
No,
Yeah.
not at all. And so I have a few thoughts about that. First of all, I think the obvious one is that when you're in the sweet spot, you are definitely in flow. It's hard, but it's not too hard, and it's
Right.
easy, but
It
not
seems
too
so
easy.
aligned. Mihai
Right.
Csikszentmihalyi's definition and what you're talking. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think that's the first easy, obvious definition. I would actually, though, also argue, and I'd be curious of how you might want to push back against this. I would argue that a peak performer is not someone who's only in the sweet spot, but it's a person who can complete this growth cycle over and over again. A person who can navigate launch points, who can move into the sweet spot, but who can also get to mastery and not just have that plateau become a precipice, but understand, okay, I need to do something that either pushes me back into the sweet spot or also able to say, okay, I know I'm here. I need to continue to grow, and is willing to self disrupt and move to the launch point of a new curve. And so for me, a peak performer, someone who is in flow in terms of their life, if we go back to this
Mm,
fractal idea, is able to navigate all aspects of the growth cycle. So yes, sweet spot, flow, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, if I'm pronouncing his name
you
very
did.
incorrectly.
Yeah, that was
Okay,
good. Yeah.
almost there. But also from a life perspective, I think it's navigating the entire cycle.
May he rest in peace as well. It's
Yes.
amazing in the past 2 years how many legends have passed away.
Mm.
The trauma, loss, and uncertainty of our world have led many of us to ask life's biggest questions, such as who are we? What is our highest purpose? And how do we not only live through, but thrive in the wake of tragedy, division, and challenges to our fundamental way of living? To help us all address these questions, process what this unique time in human history has meant for us personally and collectively, and emerge whole, I've collaborated with my colleague and dear friend, Dr. Jordan Feingold, MD, to bring you our forthcoming book. It's called Choose Growth, a workbook for transcending trauma, fear, and self-doubt. It's a workbook designed to guide you on a journey of committing to growth and the pursuit of self-actualization every day. It's chock full of research from humanistic psychology, positive psychology, developmental psychology, personality psychology, cognitive science, and neuropsychology. So lots of themes that you hear about on this podcast. And it's aimed to help us all integrate the many facets of ourselves and co-create our new normal with a renewed sense of strength, vitality, and hope. Whether you're healing from loss, adapting to the new normal, or simply looking ahead to life's next chapter, Choose Growth will help steer you there to deeper connection to your values, your life vision, and ultimately your most authentic self. Choose Growth will officially hit the shelves September 13th, and you can order your copy or the audiobook in the US now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, and all major retailers. If you're in the UK and Commonwealth, you can order now at bookshop.org.uk. We truly hope this book helps you grow and thrive and become your best self. Okay, now back to the show. Yeah, so I love what you said, and being able to navigate the cycle, having the flexibility to shift between different modes of thought is my definition of creativity. So we're very well aligned in that way. I also tend to make the distinction between peak performance and peak experience. I
Oh,
think
say more.
Okay, I will. Peak experience, I think, is usually tightly aligned with the flow state or transcendent states of consciousness. But as you said, peak performance often requires lots of different stages. Some stages of peak performance might not be peak experience. It may be the most painful shit. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Effortful, annoying, dealing with annoying people. There are a lot of annoying people on this planet, Whitney, who may not like your ideas. That's not a peak experience. So do you see the distinction I'm making here?
Yeah, I really like that. So for sort of kind of finding a way to have these overlaps. So what you suggest is that when you're in the sweet spot, you are having a peak experience, even though you're not at the peak.
Yeah.
But as a peak performer, you are capable of navigating all aspects of that growth cycle, including being at that launch point, that messy, uncomfortable,
First
gangly,
draft.
awkward, feel like an imposter sort of space, but you're willing to be there anyway.
Absolutely. Being able to tolerate that ambiguity is also a key part of the creative process for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. Well, how do you apply the S curve as a retention tool? You know, if managers want to really focus on retention and not have burnt out employees, right? That are like, I'm out. You know, this is I can't get past this first phase. You know, I'm stuck in the non-peak experience stage.
Okay, so there are a number of things to unpack there, and so I'll talk
that was
about
a complex.
Yeah, which is totally fine. So let's start with the first, which is I'm at the launch point and I can't seem to move off the launch point. I think there are two things that can happen. Sometimes we're at the launch point and people want to just give up because it is so messy and we're impatient. And like you said, we can't tolerate that ambiguity and that uncertainty. One of the reasons that this model, because it's so simple, it's so visual, is useful is you can say to someone, it is true that you may never be good at this. I don't want to dismiss that. What we don't know right now is you haven't been doing this long enough to know. What we do know for certain is that you are in this messy phase of the S curve where growth is actually fast, but it's not apparent, so you don't know. So let's stay here a little bit longer, collect a little bit more data. And if it turns out that in fact you are not gaining momentum off this curve, then it's the wrong curve. So you're not getting the product, market, or person curve fit. So I think that that's the first piece, is to be able to distinguish between the two of, are you just not good at this, or have you not put in enough time yet? That's the first thing. And I don't know that that's retention so much. That's just giving people support that they need when they're doing something new. From a retention strategy perspective, something that you can look at is a very simple example is Patrick Pichette. He was the CFO of Google for about 7 years. And when he was first interviewed for this job, he had already done operations types of roles for a number of years. And so from a domain expertise standpoint, absolutely at the top of that S curve. And so there was the real risk that he would get in there, be there for 6 months, maybe a year, figure out the lay of the land. And he's like, done, out of here, bored, needs something new to do. So he had a conversation with Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google at the time. And he said, basically, Patrick, we've got a problem. So here's what we're going to do. Every time you start to feel bored, every time you're at the top of an S curve, which is my language, he said, come talk to me and we'll find something new for you to do. And so basically every 18 months, Patrick went back to Eric and said, hey, kind of got this figured out. I need something new. And so every 18 months, they added something new. They gave him, from his portfolio of S curves, they added some new launch points. So he took over real estate, he took over Google Fiber, he took over people. And so by shifting the complexion or the makeup of his, or composition of his portfolio, he was able to stay in that same role for 7 years because they were continually finding ways to adapt and adjust the portfolio. And so that became a retention strategy by understanding Where is this person in his growth? What experience is he having? Now let's adjust it so that we can retain him.
That's great. I really, really like that. You talk about something very interesting. You talk about excavating your shadow values. Holy cow. Can you tell our listeners a little bit what that is? Because I'm super, super interested in the dark side of human
Yeah.
nature. Yeah.
Oh, aren't we all? Aren't we
We are.
fascinated by it? Yeah.
Yes. But so many of us project that and act as though we're the good ones and the other side is the evil one. And we never, we very rarely look within. So that's why I love that you bring that up.
So there's lots of different ways to think about our shadow values, and we know that this comes from again from Jungian psychology, where he talks about the shadow self
Psychology.
Yes, we love psychology. That's this podcast. So this notion of the example that I used in the book, and you might have something that you want to. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your reflections on this. But this notion of, and this happens a lot, where, for example, as a manager, we want to grow people. I don't think there's a manager on this planet, or at least 99% of the managers on this planet, who say, I want to grow my people. I want to be a great manager. But there's this shadow value, which is also, I need to preserve myself. I need to make sure that I am safe. I need to make sure that I, sitting at the top of this mountain of an S curve, am not threatened in any way. And so now enter the shadow value, because yes, I want to grow people, but growing people may mean that this person that you are growing eventually gets better at this job than you are. It may mean that eventually you need to give away your Legos and let this person take your role, and you need to jump to a new S curve. And so when you understand what your shadow values are, which is things like self-preservation, which we all have, you can then contend with it and understand, I know I said I wanted him to grow. I know I said I wanted her to grow, but I'm not making it possible for them to grow. What else is going on here? Frequently, what happens is you think, I want them to grow, but you're in this place of scarcity, not abundance, which I know you talk about. At some level, I feel like if I help them grow, there's not going to be an opportunity for me. So what do I need to do to create opportunities for myself, to create new S-curve opportunities for myself, either in this organization or in another organization, so that I feel like there is enough for me, so that now I can allow the people on my team to grow. And so that's what I mean by excavating shadow values, when there is a disconnect between what I am saying and what I actually truly believe and what I'm doing. And when you can excavate those values and you bring them out of the shadow, then you can start to address them, and you can act in your purpose, which is, I do want to help people grow, but I need to make sure that I'm growing as well. Because if I'm growing, then I will be willing to help other people grow.
Amazing. And that's what you mean by being smart about growth. Yeah, that's a big part of the process of being smart. So when you use the word growth, are we talking about different things when we use the word growth? Are you focusing on growth of results in a business context, whereas I'm talking about as a whole person growth from a humanistic existential perspective, which it's how can we merge both of our perspectives on growth?
Yeah, we absolutely can. So the publisher for my book is Harvard Business Press. So in having Harvard Business Press publish this book, of course, I need to talk about the organization. That being said, one of my fundamental beliefs is that the fundamental unit of growth in any organization, the fundamental unit of disruption, is always the individual. And so I argue that if you will grow yourself, then by definition, because of the contagion effect, you will create the conditions wherein you can grow your people. And if you yourself are growing and your people are growing, then your organization will grow. And so I think that becomes an outcome. I am focusing on growing an individual as the input, as the X variable, and the Y variable the dependent variable is the growth of your organization. So we are very much in alignment. The results happen, but that's not your starting point. It starts with you as the individual.
Amazing.
And in fact, let me share a piece of research that I think you'll find really interesting.
Please do.
So a piece of Aegon Zender did a study 2.5 years ago, and they surveyed CEOs and they said, tell us whether or not you strongly agree to transform your organization, you need to transform yourself. And 2.5 years ago, that number strongly agreed was 28%. 2 years later, post-pandemic, yay, post-traumatic growth, what they found when they administered that survey, again, 80% strongly agreed. I think that is so significant. I think that is so encouraging, this notion that these CEOs now understand that if they want to have this wholesale transformation of their organization, they need to transform themselves. And I think that we have the pandemic, at least in part, to thank for that post-traumatic growth that comes after a period of severe stress.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. This is all in line with what you do say in your book, which is people are not just the most valuable resources of the organization. They are the organization. That's a good quote there, Whitney Johnson. I like that.
Thank you.
I like that. So how can companies actively invest in their people? And why is that more important right now than ever?
All right, so let's start with why it's so important. There has been, we just talked about post-traumatic growth, and I love that the title of your book is Choose Growth. Um,
Thank you.
One of the things that we discovered over the past couple of years, and people have talked and described this period of time where people were jumping to new S-curves as the Great Resignation. And I believe that that is a major misnomer, because what we found during these past few years is that people were and are more capable, more resilient. We've discovered a lot about ourselves. And so we discovered that we want things to be different. We found ways to rebalance our lives and how we approached our world. And so when people look at this and say people are resigning from, I think that's inaccurate. I think what we've discovered is that people are aspiring to, they're aspiring to more. They are, in your words, choosing growth. And so what I would encourage any employer to do is to recognize that if you understand that the animating force for people is that they want to grow not only in their role at work, but grow as human beings, then that starts to inform how you're going to develop people, how you're going to recruit people, how you're going to retain people. Now, there's a lot that you can do, but sometimes people will say, well, I'm just a middle manager. There's not, I don't have much control. What I would say is, from an agentic standpoint, you have far more control than you think you do. And it can start with a very simple conversation, which is, let's draw an S. Let's see where you think you are in your growth. Do you think you're at the launch point, the sweet spot, or mastery? And what can I do to support you in your growth so that you can build momentum? It's a simple thing, but we know from the contagion effect, 3 degrees of separation. If you help that person grow, then they're going to help their children grow. They're going to help a coworker who's 3 degrees of separation grow. And so you can start with that individual, and that allows you as a manager to start to grow your people, which then grows your company. So that's what I would say is it's not the Great Resignation, it's the Great Aspiration. And it can start as simply as drawing an S on a piece of paper and having a conversation about where do you think you are in your growth?
Wow, you're very optimistic about 2022 as
I
being
am.
a year of tremendous growth in the workplace. Okay, well, what advice do you have for leaders to energize their team this year,
Mm,
especially amid some people feeling demotivated because of a lot of political things going on in the world right now?
mhm, mhm. Yeah. So Scott, this this starts to come to some of our a priori or foundational assumptions. And so let me tell you some of the things that I believe. And I believe that growth is our default setting,
Mm.
that we are wired to grow. And I think we all know that, but we have the growth mindset until we don't. And so I think that one of the things that for us to be aware of is that if we can if you believe that about growth and you are willing to have conversations with people about where are they in their growth and to help them build momentum along their S curve, regardless of where they are, that will help motivate them. At the same time, what I would say, and I know you said I sound very optimistic, what I do want to put forth is that we make a choice. I very much believe that we are agents. We control more than we think that we do. And I remember, and I'll share an experience that I had, and I suspect many of your listeners had something similar happen to them. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, back in March of 2020 or 2019? 2020. Oh my goodness.
I know.
Losing track
Trust
of time.
Me, I know.
I remember having this experience of when the world was shutting down, and I was very frightened. And I think many of us were, of the world, our life as we know it is changing. What does this mean for my health? Am I going to get sick? What does this mean for my business? Because I own my own business. And having this experience, I thought it was 2 days, but my truth teller daughter tells me it was 2 weeks, where I finally had to make a choice. What am I going to do here? Am I going to succumb to this feeling of fear and hopelessness that is threatening to overtake me? Or am I going to choose hope? Am I going to choose to be optimistic? Am I going to choose to see this as an opportunity to grow? Am I going to see this as an opportunity to say, I've been talking about personal disruption. Am I going to eat my own cooking and disrupt myself and find a way to manage through this, turn this constraint that I'm experiencing into a tool of creation? And so I think that we as leaders and managers, we need to create the conditions, the weather patterns whereby people can grow. We can play that role because you have to climb an S curve by yourself, but you can't do it alone. But ultimately, each person that works with us and we ourselves have to make the choice. Am I going to choose to think that I cannot do this, or am I going to choose to believe that I can? And my hope is that this S curve, because it's a simple visual model, gives people a way to say, okay, yeah, I do feel afraid right now, but I'm just at the launch point. So I'll figure it out. I believe that I can figure out. It's been done, billions of times before. I can do it again. It's a model that I can replicate.
I like that. And what if you get to you're having a quarter life crisis, or you get to middle age and you just don't feel like you're growing as fast as you had expected, which is everyone. Well, most people. You start to hit a reality when you get to a certain age that you can't be the NBA player that you thought you were going to be, or you can't be this or that, and you start to confront reality a bit. How does that play a role in this?
So I have two thoughts here. Number one is that you just got pushed off, and now you've got to make a decision about what you're going to do. I'm here. I'm stranded on this desert island. Am I, desert island S curve that I did not choose? What do I want to do? And it goes back to what we just talked about at the beginning of the pandemic. Am I going to say, oh, I'm a victim, my life is terrible? Again, this goes back to being an agent. Or are we going to figure out, how do I make meaning of this? Did this happen to me, or did this happen for me? This goes back to some of our priori assumptions that we're on this planet to grow and to develop, that growth is our default setting. What am I going to do with this constraint that's just been handed to me? And how am I going to make something out of it? So that's the near-term question that I would ask yourself. The bigger picture question, I would say, going back to your life, is if you think about your life and you think about any S curve, it's basically a dopamine management exercise. So when you're at the launch point of an S curve, you're making lots of predictions about what it's going to take for me to be successful. And many of those predictions are inaccurate. So your dopamine is dropping, which feels terrible because dopamine is the chemical messenger of delight. You're de-delighting. Then in the sweet spot, it's spiking because things are going better than you expected. And at the mastery, it's kind of flatlining. And so that's why you need a new challenge. So what I would say for those of us who are now at the launch point of a curve that we didn't actually choose, and you're saying, how do I use this dopamine to help me move out of this place that I don't think I want to be, is you set these really small goals. You don't think in terms of, what am I going to do 5 years from now? You look for wins today. You look for wins tomorrow. You look for ways to get some dopamine that will allow you to have some upside surprises that will build momentum again. And what do I mean by little wins? I mean things that you can do even if it's 11 o'clock at night. This goes to some of James Clear's work of those ridiculously small goals. I'm not exercising at all right now. I'm going to put on my tennis shoes every day for the next week. I don't feel like writing my next book. Okay, well, I'll just turn on my computer and look at my screen for 30 seconds every day for the next week. And so you do these small, small things that allow you to get a little bit of dopamine, start to build your momentum again so that you can move back into the sweet spot of your life, because you were there at one point, you can be there again. And those are the ways that you move forward when you feel like you've been kicked off the curve and don't quite have the motivation that you need to move forward.
How do you know when to grit and when to quit, though? Because you do
Oh,
talk in your book about the benefits of a career change. So
mhm.
what's so wrong with getting middle age and be like, well, that S curve was totally not what I expected. I'm gonna peace out. I mean, there's no shame in that, right?
When to grit and when to quit.
Yeah.
I'm
Did you like
sure you've
that?
said
Did you
that
like that?
before, but I have never heard it. So I just got some delight from that. Yeah, it's a great question, Scott. So what I would say, there are two different places where you're going to experience that. That the launch point that we've talked about already of like, I'm just not very good at this. Maybe it is time for me to jump to something new. But there's also the mastery phase, which we haven't talked about. And I think this is that middle life question that you just posed. And here are some of the ways that you know that it's time to no longer grit. Now, when I'm talking about being in mastery, I don't mean that you are the world's foremost expert on something. It may mean that, but it also may mean I wanted to learn 5 songs on the ukulele and I'm good. But from a career perspective, here are some things that you're going to start telling yourself. And this is what we see in our diagnostic is that you know it's time to do something new. You've been doing the same thing for several years, no significant difference. So you can look at time and role, for example. You can find yourself saying things like, that's not how we do it here. You can find yourself dialing it in. You can find yourself being jealous of other people who are moving along, that self-preservation piece where they're growing, but you're not. You're starting to stagnate. You can find yourself saying things like, well, I've paid my dues. All those are starting to give you these signals that maybe it's time for you to not grit. It's time for you to quit. If you're feeling bored, if you're feeling demotivated. But here's the most important indicator. It is when you have that experience of, I feel like there is something more for me to do. I can feel it. And if I don't do something more, I will die inside a little bit.
Mm.
I understand that I am an expert at this, but I can feel that I have more to do on this planet. I need to keep climbing. It's not on this S curve. It's time for me to do something new. That is the moment where you don't grit, you quit, you move to a new S curve.
Okay, I love that. I have a bit of a cheeky question because I can't help myself. What if
Please.
what if you feel like there is less for me on this planet? Like what if you're like not you're tired of having such high ambitions. You're like,
Mm.
I want to spend time with my family. You know, like I'm sick of working like 1,000 hours a week. Like you can't work 1,000 hours a week, but you see my point.
Yes, I do.
Is there any shame in that?
Oh, no, not
No,
at all.
no.
But I wouldn't actually call that less. I would
Mm,
call that different. I'm
fair
just
enough. Fair
finishing
enough.
reading
Yeah.
Arthur Brooks' book, and
Love
I
that
think a
guy.
lot of it,
I love
yeah,
that guy. Oh my
really,
gosh.
really,
Yeah.
really good. And so, he talks about the second curve, and that's been really interesting for me to read. But
Yes.
thinking about this idea of disruption. So let me give you a way to think about this. So when you're, let's say in your career and you're, let's call it 45 years old, and you've got sort of you're on number 12 on the y-axis of success, and you're over one, up one, and it's going along swimmingly. But you make the decision to disrupt yourself. You want to do something new. You want to work 20 hours a week, let's call it, if people have the luxury of doing that. So you move from the y-axis of success, of prestige in your work, down to a 10 because you believe that in the future it's going to be over one, up three, or over one, up five. But note that you have now changed the metrics of success. And this goes back to Clayton's work of how will you measure your life. You are changing your metric. It's not more prestige. It's not more stature. It is, I want to cultivate relationships. I want to stay in the sweet spot in perpetuity in the relationships that matter most to me. So it's not about less. And again, this goes back to the great resignation versus the great aspiration. It's changing the metrics of success. And so you're jumping to a new S curve, or you're changing the composition of your portfolio of S curves. And of course, there's no shame in that. And I think you and I, we both argue this is what it means to develop and grow as an entire human being, not just a person who is focused on their career or just focused on their relationships. It's everything in totality.
Oh, that's so good. Changing the metrics of success. Boy, do you think that our society has some messed up ideas of what it means to be successful? Like, do
Oh,
you,
yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
Is
Yeah,
part
yeah,
of your
we
project to kind of change um, or broaden people's notions of what it even means to succeed or grow in life, in your work?
yes. I don't know that I would have stated it that way.
Hmm.
I think for me, you know how one of the best ways to figure out what it is you stand for is to have someone tell you what they think you stand for, and you say, yes, that resonates.
I
And
love that.
I was having a conversation with Tom Peters, who wrote In Search of Excellence, and he said to me, Whitney, I think what your raison d'etre is you want to help people grow, big G and little g. And when I think about that, that's when I say grow, I mean grow as a human being, in every aspect of your life, mentally, emotionally, in your relationships, etc. So yes, the answer is I would like people to change their metrics of success. And coming back to Clayton, who we talked about at the very beginning, I had the privilege of working with him for the greater part of 10 years. And people could say, well, what are all the different things you learned from Clayton? And I would say one of the most important things I learned from him, this idea of metrics of success. But he did something that was so valuable to me, and I find that is staying with me, is he didn't separate the secular from the spiritual. They were, he brought work to church and he brought church to work. And so in my work, if I can encourage people to bring their secular and their spiritual together, you're bringing the whole person together, bringing the masculine and the feminine together, however you want to define that. To me, that's what real growth looks like.
No, I love that, and what an honor it was for him to work with you as well. You know,
Aw,
I
that's
know,
sweet.
and for,
Thank
and for,
you.
and for you to work with him.
Mhm.
Yeah, it must have been a really tremendous collaboration.
Mm.
Yeah. So how can you become the kind of leader or boss that people want to work for? Do you have any advice for aspiring leaders who really want to take your work and run with it?
Such a big question again, but it really, I think it starts very simply, is that start by focusing on how are you yourself going to grow. And when I say that, it can be something as simple as I'm going to disrupt myself just a little bit today. I'm going to make a decision that when I look at my list of 10 things to do today, maybe all 10 of those things right now are a list of tasks to do. And instead of having 10 tasks, I'm going to have one thing that says, I'm going to put a who on my to do list. And I'm going to have a conversation with a person about where are you in your growth. And it can start with those very simple micro disruptions, creating those new neural pathways, but they start with a cow path. And so, anybody who's listening to this and thinking, I do want to be different, I do want to be a better leader, start by figuring out where are you in your growth, launch point, sweet spot, mastery, maybe have a simple conversation, map out where your people are and their growth, and do one very small, ridiculously small thing, because you aggregate all those small things that all of your listeners are doing across the globe. That starts to aggregate into something pretty meaningful and significant, and disruption in a very, very positive way.
Well, let's end on that note. That's wonderful. Was there anything else you'd like to add to our conversation? I feel like we covered a lot of the ground of your book.
Just thank you for having me. I enjoyed reading your book and being able to talk about your work. And I just appreciate your wanting to talk about my work and just figure out how they overlap. So thank you very much.
It's great. It's really great work. I'm so glad we could finally get you on the Psychology Podcast. Thank you so much, Whitney. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com or on our YouTube page, The Psychology Podcast. We also put up some videos of some episodes on our YouTube page as well, so you'll want to check that out. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.